I think that in today's climate, one of the things that people are so interested in is what are we doing with talent? And I think we've certainly heard from all the work that we've done with our leadership programs around how can we find great talent and how can we keep great talent and how can we develop them. There's conversations about people leaving, there's conversations about finding talented people that are excited and enthusiastic about doing work within organizations. Brad, your thoughts around what makes that up a really great environment for a positive culture? I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, I think one of the fundamentals there is what we see within our leaders is the basics of being aware of the three fundamentals of being a leader, of what they need to do. And big picture, they need to be able to be effective managing their time and efficiency with their time. They need to be able to have understand how to communicate and communicate clearly and concisely with what they want to be able to get. And then the third thing is being able to transfer that knowledge. And when they're able to do those three things, and obviously if you don't have the first one sorted out, it's very hard to do the rest properly. And when we see some of the leaders that we're going through in coaching that are doing really well with that, it's interesting because they're building up team. And then in particular case I'm thinking about, they're building up team, and all of a sudden their team is exceeding quite well. And then sort of the senior management think this is great. We'll grab this person and move them on to a different department. So they're like going, oh, this is really bad. I've built up this team and done this thing, and people keep stealing things from me. And I'm like, oh, this is a great attribute to you being a leader because you've built up a team, you've gone through the process, and then as a result of that, you've got people going into other parts of the business, and that's a really good thing for your legacy. Uh, and there are other cases where people are then obviously leaving the business in certain scenarios. And I think what's really important is if you're able to get ahead and maintain that communication with your team, being clear and concise and setting up the outcomes of what they want. And obviously being able to sell your vision on where they're going, whether it be that day, that week, that quarter, that year, whether it be a project base, getting clear on that so that they understand that they're going with you and going through and doing that. One of the other things that's been really clear is sort of going through and catching people on the fly when they're talking about how they're leading. And I'm like, oh, that's an interesting conversation you just had that. Can you tell me how that was not consulting or managing the person as opposed to leading and coaching? And it's been really interesting going through and having some conversations around the communication for them to be able to get really deep into how to find out, identify the problem, and then how to be able to use communication, language, NLP's middle name, to be able to get the results that they want. And we were doing a group call the other day, and we are going through and particularly looking at identifying a problem, and then going through and looking at how people would solve that problem. And even after going through and explaining not to try and give prescription or not to try and give managing or advice or consulting, telling people what to do, and they're telling people what to do and then holding them accountable to do it from a managing point of view, all of them still went to try and solve the problem for the person. And it was really interesting, even having just gone through and doing that. And then when I said, okay, let me have a go at doing this. And when I went through to go through and do a language pattern, what we're doing, particularly we're talking about reframing, and doing that, they all saw the difference it made when you actually asked questions to get into the deep structure of the problem. So that communication is really important. And when you've got on a day-by-day basis, you're thinking about how to actually get into the real situation, this conversation, the deep structure of the problem. How do I make sure that I'm not dealing with surface problem? Because if you're working with a surface problem, which is not the actual problem, when you work with not problem, you get not result. So you want to make sure you're getting into that deep problems so that you don't have this, this lip service problems going through. The throwaway comment, I don't have time. All right, okay, all right, I can't have time. I'll find someone else who's got time. Doesn't actually solve the problem, and it leads to a scenario. So I think that when we see particular communication with leaders that actually stop and they're building some resilience to the throwaway comment, I don't have time, that's not my job. Um, you know, uh, those sort of comments that get thrown away, I'm too busy, we don't have the team, the market's this way, or this is that way. Those throwaway comments, which are very, very surface structured problems, then the leader's going to have the same problem over and over and over again. But as soon as they start going, okay, cool, let me go at this problem a little bit deeper. Let me get into the intention behind that behavior. Let me get into the deep structure of what's going in, the thinking behind that. And the leader needs to have time to be able to have that thinking. They need to have that skill set to be able to ask what are the questions they ask and what's the structure of that question. And they also have to have a high level of emotional self-regulation intelligence so that they don't get fired up and emotional in that scenario. Yeah. So I know that there's cases where there are things that get thrown around the office from time to time, and I'm not talking metaphorically speaking, when things don't go well. And as a result of that, the flow and effect of that takes place. Just recently, just this week, I was talking to a leader, and they were down on staff and they were under the pump. And what was taking place was a few of the top leaders within that department, the supervisors, were all cranky under the pump, and they had some new team members. And the coaching I was doing with this team leader was, how do I make sure that we are up against it and we're really down and annoyed because our KPIs are down, we're under the pump. How do we not make sure this doesn't affect the rest of the team? And it was like, it was a time and a place for it. As a leader, you need to be able to be the punching bag, so to speak, of, not metaphorically speaking, of course, of things going wrong. So it's not on the floor in the pit. It's not in front of the team members, so that culture is not affected. And as a result of that, that was a sort of significant takeaway about, they do need to create space to vent to be able to get it, but we need to make sure it doesn't affect the culture, because therefore, then we've got the wrong kind of communication, and we're not working within the team. So I think that overall, when we've got someone who's clear and concise with what they want to be able to do, they know they've got the time, they understand how to communicate, and they're looking at, how do I transfer this knowledge? How do I make sure this person's able to do this thing that they're able to do that I need them to do? And I can make sure that they've got it. And of course, the last piece for that transfer of knowledge, really important, is having the ownership of what you're asking them to do. And when there's that ownership, we're selling the ownership, it's getting people's point across. I think all of a sudden the dynamics change. And based on feedback recently that we've just done, it's really clear that when there's ownership in the workplace, and everyone has ownership and everyone's on the same page of what is the definition of ownership, emotionally and also in their roles, there's nowhere to hide.
And I want to pick up on something that you said there, Brad, just with relation to time, and the leaders have to have time. And I think there's probably lots of people that are listening that are going, yeah, well, of course, if you've got time, I can do all these things that I know how to do. And that's a perfect example of how people surrender ownership. It's sort of like stuff is happening to them, as opposed to, okay, well, stuff can happen. And while I may not be able to control the things that are going on outside of me, what I can control is my response to them. And it's very much that piece around slowing down to speed up, which we talk about consistently. And one of the things that I see time and time again, and I know you guys see it as well in the coaching work that we do, both one-on-one and in groups, and when we actually consult to businesses, is this concept of there's not enough time, there's too much to do, it's not my fault, and it very much becomes that blame, excuses, denial, that it's not possible to change it. So I've just got to keep going with reacting to my day or having things happen to me. And I just wanted to highlight that for just one moment, based on the fact that I think sometimes the transition between chaos and planned work is, let's be honest, it takes effort at the beginning. But as you start to actually move through those teething problems and that initial kind of, all right, well, I've got to balance the chaos and put out the grass fires, but I'm actually preparing to ensure that no more grass fires start while I'm putting out this grass fire, then that rhythm and that sequence actually starts to come into play. And one of the things that we talk about consistently is the importance of your rhythmic get-togethers, and whether that be, stand-up meetings with small teams for the day ahead, or whether that be about the one-on-one rhythm and schedule where you're actually talking through results and different things like that. All these things are actually part of creating visibility, creating open communication, and ensuring that everybody knows where they need to be, and that we're not waiting until a chaos or a problem to be able to have those discussions. And often when people are reacting to their days, or they're having challenges that come up, sometimes they know what they need to do, but they're really sabotaging their success because of the limiting ideas about what's possible. And I know that this has come up a lot in a number of the programs that we've been delivering in the last couple of months, of people making that switch in their mindset. So that mindset piece is a really big part. And I know that often, people hear the word mindset and they go, oh, well, here we go with that airy fairy stuff again. The reality is how we look at a situation is always going to impact the way in which we respond to it. So, Alex, I know you had some recent sessions where, people really changed their perspective about what was possible, both around time and around touch points. Did you have some comments and thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chantel. So I guess one of the things that is, as you've already mentioned, is really important in terms of leadership is being able to get on top of your time management. And I feel that that's where there's the biggest gap. And of course, as you know, it's one of the first things we work on with our leaders and make sure that we get them set up for success throughout the week. But it's not just about them setting themselves up. It's looking at their teams, making sure everybody's aligned, on board. What are the outcomes? What are we working towards this week? And it's making sure that you're working with people and resourcing them so that they can be effective in what it is that they need to do. And as you just mentioned, when people are a little bit unresourceful, they come to a stop. They tend to have a little bit of procrastination kick in, and of course that's when we start to hit roadblocks and find ourselves in trouble. So it's setting yourself up for success. It's making sure with your time, as you mentioned, it's about finding flow in your week. So it's not turning up to work every week and run one day that leads into the next. You go home, you're stressed, the work-life balance becomes affected. And so, bringing in different procedures and different ways of being able to set your week up is absolutely imperative. People feel like they're more in control. People feel like when we show them how to set their week up for flow, that they're not running on adrenaline anymore. They're very concise in their actions. They're able to have congruency in the decisions that they're making because they're not under stress. And as we know that when we fall into stress, a stress state, our IQ drops, and it's a fact, and we find ourselves a little unresourceful. So I find that, in terms of leadership, when they set up their teams to be effective with their time management, and it starts with them being the role model, of course, they will be modeled the whole time by all of their team, and it's setting them up to be it's setting them up for success, and being able to get through their week resourced. And like I said before, it's about finding flow.
And, I want to pick up on something that you said there just around, stress levels and the ability to think clearly from a logical, strategic planning, problem solving perspective. And, sometimes when we go into corporate environments and we start talking about mind-body connection or physical health and things like that, there can be some resistance because people go, oh, well, this is a corporate environment, it's not a health school, or it's not, we're not looking at, sometimes it's seen as airy fairy stuff, but there's a lot of scientific facts and studies around, cortisol levels, which is obviously the stress hormone, and our actual ability to be problem solving and to think straight and to be able to be resilient in the face of that. And I think it has a lot to do with talent development. And one of the things that we have seen as a group, and certainly in the clients that we've worked with, is that talent is expecting so much more from their leaders these days. It's not just about giving me the skills to be able to do my technical job or the technical aspects of my job. We look to our leaders now and we expect so much more in terms of soft skills development, the ability to be resilient, teaching people about things that potentially they weren't taught in school around, managing their own cash flow situations and how they deal with money. Some of them are looking for soft skills in terms of how do I actually learn how to be empathetic. One of the things that we've certainly seen with the generational differences in a workplace, obviously we've got 4 generations working in many workplaces, large workplaces, as well as, new generations emerging. there is this, difference of opinion and also difference of skill set in terms of the way that we learned. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that one end of the generational scale is different from the other, that it is better or worse than the other. They're just different. And the exposure that we've had to resources as we've, grown up and learnt life skills has been very different with the emergence of technology. So what we're definitely seeing, and I know all of us in our engagement with clients have seen that some of the things that potentially your baby boomers and your Gen X generations took for granted in terms of, how to build empathy or emotional regulation, understanding emotions, may be seen differently for people who are in Y and Z and, alphas that are, coming through. And I think it's really interesting because if you're a leader and you've got people who are of different generations in your team, your approach has to be adaptable. And I think that has a lot to do with the way in which we succession plan and also how we respond flexibly to the different people in our team to continue to create a positive culture for everyone. Because what looks like a positive culture for one group of people might look like a toxic culture. Actually, interesting thought. I had a briefing the other day, and I was told that there is an overwhelming sense from Gen Z that the thumbs up emoji is actually seen as aggressive. And so we have these situations where, different age brackets. I even saw a video the other day. I'm sure you've seen them on social media where the alphas have their own language for everything. And it's quite a joke where they have the reels and, the adult is, saying what these words stand for. So Brad, I'm curious, we've been doing lots of projects where we've got people of all different ages and all different skill sets. What's your thoughts around, talent development and what people are expecting from us now?
Yeah, I think it's very clear that it's a moving dancing carpet, moving goalpost, dancing carpet, depending on what analogy you want to put through to it. But it's certainly on the up of change, and we're seeing that obviously within young teams, there's going to be potential an age discrimination taking place where you're not going to hire anyone who's outside that demographic, and then as a result of that, you're kind of fostering the same environment and the same problems where people prefer to send a message to the person sitting next to them rather than go, hey, what do you think about this? So I think that when we're in developing talent and looking at that, we've got to be able to go to where they are within the generation. I'm not going to get specific, but go to where they are and sort of open up and introduce the concept of behavioral flexibility. So
yeah,
when
and it's
we've
about
got
having that appreciation as well, isn't it? Like
yeah.
it could be, we could be talking about early careers people who are managing people who are older than them. So how do we go to where they're at, or potential experienced people who have been in the field for 15, 20 years that are now hiring, these Gen Z. So it's not specific to one end or the other.
Yeah, exactly. And you've got to be able to understand that behavioral flexibility is effectively showing that you are creating an environment, culture, which is open to that. And then once we've got the talent there and we've got the skill set that we need, then we were about looking at making sure they can do the job. And then how do we make sure that we can keep them and nurture them? And then with that comes the development of being able to improve their ability to communicate not only with their initial cohort, but also outside of their comfort zone and going through and doing that. And it was interesting. I was having a conversation a little while back with a young leader who was managing a lady in her 50s, and I'm kind of aware of what happens to a lady in her 50s now with my wife and everything, and it was like this fact of like, I don't understand what's going on, and I said, well, and this person was going through the process of wanting to have a baby and getting pregnant. And I said, all right, so you're in that period of time of your hormones are there, and you've got the teenage puberty going through that sort of scenario. And then there's the other part of it, which is where you're going into perimenopause and menopausal. There's other emotional factors that are taking place that are physical here that are having a place on a work and having an effect on the workplace. This is a generational sort of example of what's happening. And it was completely out of awareness. She had no idea. And as a result of that, it completely broke down the barriers of her resistance to her and just saw another whole way of oh, I need to take that into consideration, that I need to change my expectations and the way I communicate with her so that I make sure, because she's really good at what she does, I just understand why there's this mismatch. And it was really, really sort of blatantly obvious of that there's different generations and there's different times in life, all in the same workplace, all contributing their own way, but the disconnect. And as soon as that took place, I could sort of see, and since then I've noticed that that relationship has changed because that the younger leader has got a little more flexibility with the person in at that age group. And as a result of that, it's been a fundamental shift. And if that wasn't dealt with, then we could have probably lost someone who was quite a fair amount of tenure and a lot of experience in that business because they just didn't feel that they could do it. They may have felt that they can't do the job anymore, and all these young people are too fast, and they're expecting too much. And then maybe lost performance, maybe sabotage, maybe left the business, and then we would have lost that potential of that mentoring, that expertise in that length of time in that business. And if that had happened, then that young person would have then had to try and find someone to hire, and then probably would have just gone through that process of creating that. So I think that in all areas, if we're looking at what we need to do as far as creating that environment where there's flexibility, there's certainly scenarios where there's a level of frustration, and that's across every generation with the other generation. And when that takes place, we're kind of stopping the opportunity for us to create that culture. So I think the first thing in order for us to create that generational, closing that gap as far as the beliefs around those and the connection of, and creating that talent is realizing there are strengths and weaknesses within that and having the behavioral flexibility to look at how do I maximize this? How do I maximize that? And how do I myself be able to adapt and change from one conversation to the other with my intention and my beliefs so that I'm always creating a space for development and growth. So I'm never creating a space where I'm feeling people are left out or less than in that environment, because and the other part of that is making sure we're still challenging people, because we know if people get in that comfort zone, that place of being stagnant in the role for too long, we know that there is a typical itch cycle where they'll go through a process and they'll be looking for something else. And sometimes that's looking for a different company. And it may not necessarily be the real solution. It can be just a different position, a different role within the company, and looking at that. I think that's a really important thing to look at within your team and maintaining talent is how long is someone going to be in a role before you need to have the conversation about what's next for them and being able to go through and do that. With another client we're working with a little while back, and they have completely, in the particular industry they're in, there's lots of expectations and there's kind of a rule of thumb in their industry, and they wanted to not have that same culture that other businesses have in that industry. So they made a decision to recruit out of university people who had done university degrees, so that they had that was part of their rule. They had their reasons for that, and in the interview process, they showed them what was the transition for where they need to go. How long was it to be in this role? What were the key marks you need to take? And if you achieve this and do this, you'll be able to move to this level in this period of time with that. And that was at the beginning of their journey. So this person coming to the business knew that that's where they were going. And the great thing about doing this is you're effectively like almost setting a goal for them. You're creating a picture of them seeing themselves in that role through multiple levels, and you're also seeing themselves achieve those outcomes over those series of times. And when you start doing that, the person's automatically talking themselves in emotionally, unconsciously, consciously into that role. Now, the culture has to work and there has to be follow through on those sort of things, because as soon as what you say doesn't happen, there's going to be some blowback there. But it's very clear that when that's done well, you're able to really keep your talent going through because you're challenging them. You're being careful of that comfort zone. And really important, because I think as soon as you're into that comfort zone, it's also very much nice that everything's going fine. We're cool. It's the bliss. Everything's going great. And then all of a sudden, the motivation kicks in of some away from motivation, and then we're creating or throwing grenades into our team.
I want to pick up on something that you said there in terms of the journey. And I think that often what can happen is that there is no clear pathway for, especially we see it with medium businesses. Obviously, with large and enterprise businesses that we work with, there's often some kind of idea around what the pathway is for people. Though that being said, we'll never make assumptions, because we've worked with some very big organizations that have no clearly defined pathways for their team members, other than to perhaps maybe move into a management position. And when we talk about culture, part of what makes a positive culture is having happy individuals that get along with each other, that then create an environment that thrives. And there's the ability for cross collaboration and, celebrating wins, working through challenges, etc. And one of the key things about human behavior is often people will have something that drives them either away from pain, or it will drive them toward the possibility of pleasure or something to look forward to. And actually, there's a really interesting study recently just talking about that mind-body connection and the scientific kind of aspects of our happiness and, body chemicals and things like that. There was a study that was done that people actually get more of a dopamine hit from the looking forward to a holiday than they do from the holiday that they actually go on. And so when we think about career progression, what are we looking forward to, or what do our team members have to look forward to in terms of their development, what they can learn, what's next in their career journey? And often when people enter into organizations where they've been part of graduate programs, they've been at university, and then they get into a big five or what have you, they often will have clear career pathways. But for often businesses that are more medium in their size, or potentially they don't necessarily have those types of curated programs, there can be a lack of visibility for the individual about where they can go, what they can do, and what skills do they need to develop to be able to bridge the gap between where they are now and their next promotion or their next step in their career journey. I know, Alex, you've go on, Brad.
Yeah, I think it's really important as well, because often what happens if we don't actually develop their skills and we don't let them know what the skill they need to develop, we don't do that, we're effectively developing the skill of the imposter syndrome. And they get there, they get promoted, and then they don't actually feel that they're worthy of being there.
Yeah, actually, I had a really interesting session a few days ago with someone who I would consider to be a fairly senior level executive, feeling a bit stuck in their career journey. And when I was talking to this lady, it was sort of like, I know that I need to be developing this, and I'm really not sure what it is. And after a few questions, we actually came down to the fact that not only did she not know what skills and things she needed to develop to get to the next level, she actually was feeling really incongruent about what she wanted, because there was no one to say what possibilities there were for her to start to get some ideas about what might be the next step in her career. And so, Alex, I know you and I have been doing a project recently where we've seen the impact of some of those things in terms of pathway progression, and particularly when we look at, gender equity and things like that, that can also play a role. What have been some of the high-level comments that you shared with me the other day? Obviously, keeping people's names and identities, under discretion. What have you seen as being the main impact of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's interesting across the board talking to different people within the business, obviously different levels of leadership. And a lot of the times, and I hate to say it, but a lot of the times I feel people hold themselves back, and it's easy to fall into the old value system or value, as you understand, value levels. We're all operating and our values levels are changing at the moment. We're seeing it in the people that we're coaching. And once again, as Brad mentioned before, it's meeting people where they're at and developing them from where they're at. And that's been really, really interesting. So with the higher levels of management, as we're developing the lower levels and they're starting to come up and really shine and start to see other possibilities that they never once knew were there, it's making sure that we're cleaning up, their neurology, the way they're thinking about their own progression, what is it that they're capable of within the company. And of course, once the limiting beliefs and that restrict them from being able to, progress, once we actually work with people and we create the shift and people create shift in their own mindset, it's amazing the opportunities that it opens up. And the progression of some of the people that we've been working with has just been absolutely phenomenal. Some of the feedback we've had from one of the leaders in particular is, that I need to ease up a little bit. We need to be a little bit mindful that, as we're encouraging these workers to come up and through the system, so to speak, that where's their place going to be if everybody's starting to become quite progressive in their role. And to be honest, it absolutely overjoys me, because as I said to him, well, if you're a phenomenal leader, you'll be recognized for that. And then obviously you get to move up as well. So we're actually collectively progressing together. And I think that's really important in terms of the mindset for people, is they need to be mindful and respectful of the fact that, you can be a phenomenal leader. And I think the old mindset was, if I'm a really great leader and people come up, then my role's at risk. And look, it's the ultimate compliment, isn't it? But the thing is that if you're recognized and seen as a phenomenal leader and you're bringing people up through and around you, then there creates a space for you as well to progress in your career. So I feel like it is a collective whole. But looking at where we started to where we are now, it's a phenomenal difference. Like it's incredible the amount of growth that people have had. And once again, it comes back to being clear on what it is that they are wanting to do, because we can't upskill them and we can't give them the resources and things that they need unless they know what it is that they want. Yeah. And it's also removing the limiting thinking as to what's available to them. So a lot of these people have stepped in, thinking that, this is it for them and they have to become exceptionally good at what it is that they're doing in their role. But there's a bigger picture here, and a lot of these companies, and some of the ones that we're working with in particular, have a really great program, or encouraging and supporting people to actually take that step. And mentorship is key in being able to give these people confidence to actually bring them up and through their own leadership journey.
Yeah. And I think I want to pick up on something that you said there a second ago, just with relation to meeting people where they're at. But more importantly, with relation to, where they are now to where they want to be. And I think, all of us in our work with individuals and groups and, with the different organizations that we help and we support, what we see is that generally there is a disconnect for people around where they currently are. And in many cases, when we're talking about taking ownership and people actually taking responsibility for what's going on for their career, for themselves personally, as well as for their teams. And this is managing up as well as managing down. It's not necessarily just, managing your own scenario or the team below you. It might even, or that is reporting to you. It's also about kind of understanding what is going on in the leadership levels that you're reporting to, so that you have an idea of your pathway. And what's interesting to me about that is that often, and what we see time and time again at all levels of leadership, not specific to emerging leaders, but at all levels of leadership, is that often people know where they are, but they don't actually know where the desired place is that they'd like to be. And if we don't know where we're going, it's a little bit like if I said, hey, Alex, let's go for a drive. You grab your keys and I'll meet you in the car. You get in the car and you go, okay, Shondell, where are we driving to? And it's like, I don't know, let's just drive around and see where it takes us. And you're kind of reacting to this journey that you don't really know whether you, and where this is challenging, especially when it comes to metrics and measurement in business, is there's no way for us to be able to say, well, actually, I'm there now. And so what's the next goal? So people just sort of start existing in their environments in their workplace. Brad, I can see you really want to share something. Go ahead.
Yeah. And it's that point, right? So, and the thing that's coming up when you're saying that is that conversation where we're working with a very high-performing, up-and-coming emerging leader, quite young, highly professional in the sports background, leading into business, very, very switched on, very committed, everything going for him on an absolute fantastic journey ahead of his peers as far as age of where he's going, and doing really, really well in lots of ways. And going through it, we realized that he thinks he's got everything. And he came from a sales background, and that's hard knocks, and it's consistency. You're going through it, and you go through there, and you pick yourself up, and you're dealing with objections, and every day you got to go through that, and you got to keep the end in mind, and you're working towards the goal. You get that goal, and then pick yourself up, and away you go again. And the realization of going through this, and when we're going to conversation, I said to him, the skills, the methodology, the thinking, the neurology, everything that's got you to here is great, but it's not going to get you the next step. And I think it was a huge realization for him. He said, yeah, you're absolutely right. I can't go back and just roll up my sleeves and start selling my way across this. I've got to be able to take people with me. I can't do it on my own anymore. I've got an entire team to be able to go through this. And I think that's that realization, and if you are at that point where you think you're at it, you're at the pinnacle, you're there, you're in that comfort zone, that's because you're using the same neurology, the same thinking, the same skills, the same processes, the list goes on, of what's got you to that point. And as we know, the evolution of thinking and the constant evolution of change, if you're not aware of it, change is inevitable. It's going to happen. And it's your choice. You either drive the change and take the change by the horns and make it happen, or you sit back there and let change happen to you. And in some cases, when a leader is stagnant in that scenario and they're not thinking about different, that change being done to you is you lose talent. They leave. They're not seeing the progression. They see you being there stuck, not moving forward, consciously or unconsciously. You're sabotaging their development by not moving forward. So therefore, bang, end of the day, your talent, the best team are going to leave. And we see this time and time again because what got you to here is not going to get you to there. You've got to get out of that comfort zone. You've got to think about, what do I need to do with my team? What do I need to do with myself? How do I get feedback? How do I develop? And if you feel that you're at the end of that point where you can't go any further, then that is super, super dangerous. And I think I'd encourage anybody who's at that point is to reach out and find out a way of being challenged on your neurology and your thinking to be able to get beyond that, because it's going to come back to haunt you in the fact that you will have situations in the business where you could have been prepared for this, whether it be talent, whether it be the environment, whether it be the economy, it's going to be shifting and changing. And if you're not on the front foot of that, looking ahead, learning those skills to get you to there, you're going to be taken over, left behind, or left hang out to dry, I think is probably the harsh reality.
Yeah, I think so important in terms of the comfort zone. And I think, as you guys know, one of my favorite things to say all the time is that, we see people where they're like, when am I going to get there? And it's like, there is no there is no summit. It's one of the pieces of information that I share sometimes, that for some people it feels like I've taken off the gloves. And I think that the quicker we can come to, especially when we're looking at strategic planning and succession planning for our leaders, for ourselves, for what's happening in the future with career progressions and business development, growth and scale, we need to be thinking about, how do we stay out of the comfort zone? Because as you said, Brad, the comfort zone is very dangerous. A lot of people aspire to get to a comfort zone. When am I going to arrive there? Where's the summit? If I can just get to here, then I can relax. And the reality is that in business, in any kind of environment, there's always going to be problems. You just want to change the quality of the problems that you have by managing expectations and putting great systems in place. But I guess what I want to say about the summit and the fact that there is no summit is that we often refer to the comfort zone as the discomfort zone. Because as you said, Brad, often when people are looking at the inevitable model of change and those sorts of things, you can be affected by the inertia of change, or you can actually lead the charge of change so that it can serve you and you can actually be in a position where you get to write that story how you want to write it. And so I think if our listeners can take one thing away from today, it is that the comfort zone is not comfortable. It's actually a discomfort zone. And that certainly, if we're aspiring to be in a comfort zone, then we might need to take a step back and look at our leadership mindset and ask, is this really where we need to be to lead the change for our teams, for ourselves, for our career development?
Yep. And dragging our talent with us as opposed to having them leave.
And I think it's really interesting that you use the word dragging and probably intentionally. The interesting thing about that is that often people do feel like this is a lot of work. And I just want to acknowledge the elephant in the room, because sometimes we've had comments and feedback from people when we talk to them about the journey, slowing down to speed up, managing expectations, touch points, building these things, communicating frequently. You can sometimes get a leader that might be already tired, perhaps in cortisol, land, and probably exhausted, fighting management on why the results aren't where they need to be, and then fighting their team members about why they're not performing. And so there can be an exhaustion associated with that. And this is where that mindset and resilience piece comes in, and particularly in emotional intelligence. We know that the five pillars of emotional intelligence are around, awareness, resilience, motivation, empathy, and social skills. And when it comes to these things, I think sometimes what can happen is people go, oh, it's all so much work, I can't keep up with it. And if you've not been on track with it, then the initial change or that switch of mindset or the enforcement of new boundaries or the communication of new boundaries can actually feel like a lot of work. The reality is, though, is that you're actually making an investment to get a return on it. And so when we think about the work that we're doing and the comfort zone, you have to keep reinvesting in, and to keep topping up the resources in the emotional bank accounts, in the physical bank accounts, in the KPI bank accounts, etc., to make sure that you've got actually currency to withdraw on. And I think that's a really important point when we think about longevity, as opposed to the energy that it takes in the first 15% to actually make that change.
And it comes to mind in the book Checklist Manifesto. I can't remember the name.
Atul Gawande, the Checklist
Manifesto.
It
was really interesting talking about change, and they were talking about in a situation, a hospital context. Yeah, so they were wanting to bring in a checklist system, and all the hospitals were against it because they're so busy. And he was out there banging on about how much this is going to work and how effective it is, but he had no way of implementing into the hospitals. But what he didn't realize that behind the scenes, some of the administrators heard what he said. And whilst they didn't put a checklist in as he was doing it, they did have a team, being nurses, going through and collecting data on what was happening. And it was particularly regarding intensive care, and particularly within lines being put into intravenous lines and things like that, and the infections that lead to that. And as a result of the nurses doing this, they were able to find out what took place. And long story short, it's an interesting book full of medical details, which will make some people dry rich.
Exactly. Big shout out to Atul Gawande. Great book, The Checklist Manifesto. And so without all the gory details, Brad.
Yeah. What showed was that by going through and making this change, albeit small, they were able to reduce the amount of fatalities, and they were able to increase the bottom line by millions and millions of dollars in one of the most under-resourced and poorest areas in a hospital, which deal with a high level of gunshot and those sort of things. They were able to really make a significant amount of difference. And if it wasn't for being aware of that change, wasn't being aware of being able to get out of that slowing down to speed up, it never would have happened through that. And that's in the context of checklists. But it's a good example of sometimes we don't actually see the financial reward on what we're doing, as opposed to the emotional reward as far as the time we have in that there as well. So really interesting. So just bought that just sort of come to mind as we're talking about the investment. What's in it for me, in being able to look at that change and maintaining talent. And we all know that the cost of recruiting and training is a significant cost to a business. The two probably biggest costs to business is acquisition of a new client, and being able to train new staff. And if those two things are costing you more than you're making, then you are certainly not going the right direction.
Yeah, and it's a couple of things I want to add to that with relation to what you said. The gets it once it can do it, super important. What's in it for me? A lot of the time, people are looking at what's in it for the business or what's in it for themselves, but we've got to think about it, what's in it for everybody, and how can this maximize the results that we're getting in every way, shape, or form. And of course, it's not just about checklists. It's about being able to recognize that as part of what we're doing to create a culture, there are going to be elements that are very much in the details of what we need to do on a day-to-day basis, measured by specific numbers in activity and things like that, critical drivers, KPIs. But we also have to have the ability to zoom out as well and go, well, by making this investment, what's the big picture of that? Like, what will we see? Maybe not in the next couple of weeks, but what will we see over the next month, over the next 2 months? And I know both of you have heard me bang on before about the importance of recognizing that the problems and the chaos of today often had hints and tips about the fact that 6 to 12 weeks ago, had we been looking for the right things, we probably would have seen that. And that's something that we all teach to our clients when we're looking at the grass fires versus how does the investment we need to make fit into the bigger picture. Alex, did you want to chime in? It looked like you wanted to say something with relation to the activity then. It's all good if you didn't. I just wanted to double check.
Yeah, very familiar. Conversations are very familiar. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think one of the key things, when we look at activity, when we look at big picture and goals, the one thing that I would like to say about that was the zooming in and zooming out. If you think about it like a camera, whether you're thinking of a DSLR camera or you're thinking of just on your iPhone or your smartphone, when you pinch the screen to zoom out and zoom in, I think one of the best skills that a leader can have in the ability of being able to develop leaders of tomorrow and leadership within themselves is that ability to continually check in on the specifics, but also zoom out again to be able to see how does what I'm doing here actually impact the overall bigger picture. I know, Brad, this is a conversation that we've had, particularly in our multi-tiered leadership programs when we're working at, different levels of leaders, that, this can be a talent that some people have naturally and some that others have to grow.
Yeah. And again, I think what happens is it comes back down to that fundamentals of time. If you feel you're under the pressure and don't have time, you don't get a chance to stop and look at zooming out or zooming in to sort of look at what's going on there. We know that there's certain businesses that are very, very good with their reporting as far as data goes, but they run in their reports for the sake of running the report. They don't actually have a chance to look at, okay, what can I do with that? And that comes back down to that old fundamental of the 80-20 rule. And are you working on the business or in the business?
Yes.
And I think that zooming in and zooming out is in a classic case of where you need to be working on the business. And if you're working in the business all the time, you got your blinkers on. You're right up, nose is right up close to the plexiglass. You can't sort of see where the opportunity is, and you're just running at speed to deal with the day-to-day, dying to get to Friday afternoon.
Totally. And I think one other thing I want to add to that is that we can sometimes then lose track of, like, we don't know where the problem is until it's a really big problem. We had an example, one of the businesses we were working with recently, and a pretty senior leader that had been given direction to focus on building a particular area of the business operationally. And they were very focused on one key metric to measure. And so as they focused the entire team on building that one key metric, that number grew and they exceeded their goals in that area, and their margin tanked as a result of growing that one metric or that one number. And so if we think about this in the context of a leader being able to measure results, and you said it earlier, Brad, what got us to here. So the strategy that got us to here is not necessarily going to be the strategy that gets us to the next level. And that's relevant in your job, in your career, in your work, on the way in which you undertake projects, etc. And so when we think about that, this particular leader had spent so much time focusing on measuring that one number and seeing that one number going up, but not taking any time to think about the consequences of what actually is making this number grow. And as it turned out, they'd sort of, absolutely tanked their profit margin and their gross margin by looking at some of these metrics by focusing only on one area. And I think that for any of our listeners, that's an important thing to remember, that if you focus just on one thing without seeing how that one thing fits into the big picture, and zoom out a little and go, okay, is everything else staying where it needs to be while we're doing this, or is it going in the direction that it needs to go that's representing that shift? That's a really important part of not letting those grass fires blindsight you because you weren't looking at the big picture.
Yeah, we see that a lot, don't we? We see leaders jumping from fire to fire to fire to fire, and then having to come back and put the first fire out that they started, first fire that was started, backing again and wondering, what am I doing? How is this possible? I can be constantly just going through this. What's going on here? And again, my question was, well, how come you seem to be? What are you not doing you should be doing? So you'd have to come back and put out another fire again. Let's remove the fuel.
Absolutely. And that comes back to that consistency. You know, I'm thinking about the hairdressing industry, I'm thinking about the recruitment industry, some of the areas where we serve. And, you know, often what can happen is we see people who will do training on one particular skill set, or they'll spend time organizing one skill set, whether it's increasing phone calls or whether it's increasing, retail sales or consultation or what have you. And they'll train their team on that thing. And while they're putting their focus on that thing, all the other aspects kind of fall down in results. And so they finish training that thing and go, oh no, now this bit's upset. So we have to go and do something on that bit. And so while they're focusing on that thing, then all the other stuff falls down. And so it's really important, coming full circle to the chat that we were having earlier about this, is the rhythm of your connections and your timeframes needs to be consistent rather than an all or nothing approach. And so we have seen in the past, when we've stepped in the first part of the engagement with some of our clients, that they have been doing ad hoc training based on when there's a problem. And so, bringing that rhythm around consistency makes sure that people are achieving mastery and flow, as opposed to this lumpy effort of, I've got to, fix this right now. Then, okay, we're exhausted, so we'll take a little rest. Now, this is broken, we've got to fix this, instead of just maintaining consistency across the board.
Yeah, very good.
Excellent. So thank you for the chat. Very good to catch up with you guys and talk all things leadership. And